Hello and welcome to the fifth and final card review video for the Line Unbroken, taking on the first stage custom expansion. Here we're looking at the Law and Neutral cards, beginning with the Law heroes.
Okay, then the first hero is Kirdan, who is a 9 threat cost hero with 3 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, 4 hit points, the Teleri and Noble traits, and his text reads, Kirdan gets a +1 defense for each attached character. Planning action, attach a character to Kirdan. This character is considered to be out of play. At the end of the round, heal 3 damage on that character and put it back into play. Limit twice per round.
Now in the story, Kirdan was one of the original elves who was supposed to go to Valinor, but because his leader Thingol went missing on the way, he ended up just staying in Middle-earth and establishing the havens on the coast, and then basically has just stayed in some havens on the coast for the rest of the first age, the second age, and the third age. He is, of course, still around in the time of the official content and has recently been released as Kirdan the Shipwright, which presents some interesting problems with regards to the approved list, since not only is he a different sphere and has completely different stats, he also has different traits and a different name, because the first stage version does not include his title, the Shipwright. So I don't know what Ian's going to do about that, whether he'll be allowed or not. As far as his mechanics go, well, you can kind of look at it two different ways. You can look at him as a healing effect, or you can just look at him as a potentially solid defender. You play a couple of cheap allies, attach them to him, and he has a consistent 4 defense, and he's in the law sphere, so you can give him a burning brand. On the other hand, if you look at it as a healing effect, then you just wait until characters are damaged, and then you have to not use them for a round while they get their hit points back.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting ability, which I suppose is just a general principle that law is the sphere for having those kind of interesting, odd abilities.
Weird, where you're like, I'm not sure. Do I need to use this? Do I want to use this? Maybe.
If I'm honest, I haven't managed to make great use of quite a few of the law cards in the first stage. Maybe some of that's personal preference for not playing as much law, but I think Kirdan, it's probably worth noting as well, if you are thinking of making use of his ability for defensive purposes, then obviously some readying is
because you probably want to use that 3 willpower as well.
Exactly. Though, in that regard, 1 readying effect might be enough, just so he can quest and defend. Though, obviously, as usual, multiple defenses become a possibility.
I mean, one thing that's important to note is that the first stage has a limited number of healing effects. In fact, I think in the core first stage set, Kirdan is the only one. And then if we look on the approved list, the Daughter of the Nimrodel is on the approved list. Ally Elrond is on the approved list. The Sylvan Tracker and Welling Hall Preserver are very trait-specific healing. Healing herbs, but that's
self-preservation.
Not so commonly used. Self-preservation is an option, but it's for a single character. Lembas, there have been more added since the release of the first stage, but when it first came out, there was not a lot of healing, which potentially increases the value of what healing you do have.
Yes.
It should be noted, of course, that Kirdan cannot heal himself, which can be a problem. If you want to make use of the healing and the defense to a certain extent in the same game, one obvious combination that I would think would be if you have a decent defending character, ally or hero, who is still going to be taking some damage. So then gradually they'll take some damage. Once they've got 3 damage, you attach them to Kirdan and he deals with defending for the round. And then the following round you have your defender back with all their hit points again. And he has the standard -1 threat discount.
Moving on then, our next hero is Turgon, who is an 11 threat cost hero with 2 willpower, 2 attack, 3 defense, and 5 hit points, the Noldor, House of Fingolfin, and Noble traits, and his text reads, Response, after raising your threat, name an encounter card type. Look at the top card of the encounter deck. If it matches the type you named, draw 1 card. If not, shuffle the encounter deck. Limit once per phase.
Now, Turgon in the story was the King of Gondolin, which was the last of the elven strongholds to fall, not the last elven stronghold. The last elven stronghold that was still around would be the Havens, where Kirdan was. But Gondolin was the last big city of the elves, and it was, as I say, the last to fall, and also perhaps the one that Morgoth was most worried about, partly because he could never find it for centuries on end. As far as his ability goes, if you want to use it reliably, obviously you can scry the encounter deck in other ways. On the other hand, if you guess, then potentially if you get it right, then you do then know what the next card of the encounter deck is. On the other hand, you can do it based on what you think is most likely, based on an analysis of the encounter deck, or you can just guess the thing that you would be most happy to see.
The one thing I would always say is it's usually worth not naming treachery, because the one thing you really don't want to see is a treachery, and so what you maybe don't get your card draw, but reshuffling upon seeing a treachery can obviously be to your advantage.
So, most likely, you're okay with seeing another location. So if you always name location, your odds are probably reasonable, and also you'll see a location, and then that'll be fine. If you don't see a location, you'll reshuffle the encounter deck and maybe you get a location. It can get rid of some cards that you don't want to see. Which, of course, you can also do that if you've scryed. If you scry the encounter deck and see a card that you don't want to have revealed, then you could deliberately trigger Turgon to reshuffle the encounter deck by guessing wrongly.
If anything, it's one of the things that I would say with Turgon's ability is it's important not to just see it as a source of card draw. Because if you're looking at it and just going, this is a potential way of drawing another card, well, it might be, but in some ways it's worth remembering that sometimes shuffling up the encounter deck is exactly what you want, particularly if, for example, you would prefer not to see a treachery.
Yeah. Turning away briefly from his ability to the stat line, obviously it's a versatile one. He can quest, he can attack. He's best as a defender. 3 defense and 5 hit points in lore. Obviously, you probably want to give him a burning brand, and he can defend very well. But you can also get him some readying effects. He's a target for Light of Valinor. If you want to quest with him, there's some flexibility there.
The other thing which you mentioned is actually going back to his ability, which is the actual triggering of it, of course.
Yeah.
Because it merely says after raising your threat. So the first thing to realise is that it will always trigger in the refresh phase without having to do anything else.
You always raise your threat then. And it's important to note that it is a limit once per phase. It's like those cards in the official pool, like Leadership Hero Faramir and Hero Mablung, where it's a limit once per phase, not once per round, so you can start thinking about creative ways to trigger it more than once in multiple phases. In this case, obviously, if a Doomed card is revealed by the encounter deck during staging, then that will trigger Turgon. Or you can potentially do it at will with player Doomed cards. Morwen allows you to raise your threat whenever you want, twice per round. So if you really want to trigger Turgon multiple times, you can increase her willpower in 2 different phases just to draw more cards or reshuffle the encounter deck more than once.
Potentially, you could even make use of that by, say, doing so in the planning phase, just so she's got the extra point of willpower for questing, then during the quest phase anyway, because, again, more willpower.
Yep.
I know both of us have also noted the possibility of Findwilas.
Yes, if Findwilas leaves play, you raise your threat by 2. Yes. And trigger Turgon. You can also use Turin's ability to increase his attack.
Turin, I think, is potentially one of the most powerful combinations.
Yes, because if you wanted, you could increase his attack by 1 every phase, just to
up until
use Turgon again.
Up until the combat phase, triggering Turgon every time, and netting about 6 extra points of attack out of it, which...
Yeah.
You might be in a situation where that is actually going to be helpful. It's doing a lot to your threat, but...
Yeah. And then the final one would be, from the approved list, the Palantir, which, of course, does everything Turgon does as well. It raises your threat, It draws you cards and it scries the encounter deck. So you can look with the Palantir at the top 3 cards and see, as a result, what the top one is, and you'd possibly draw some cards from the Palantir, and then you know what the top card is to name it for Turgon when you raise your threat for the Palantir. You are then guaranteed to draw at least 1 card as a result of the Palantir, even if you guess wrong for all 3. And potentially, if you're right on all 3, then you draw 3. If you're right on 2, then you still draw 3 because of Turgon. And when we get into this sort of realm of exploiting the once per phase limit, then it starts to become much more worth it to actually scry the encounter deck first with something like the Palantir or Henamarth Riversong, who is also on the approved list, because then you obviously will guess right every phase, and so you can potentially... If you scry the encounter deck after staging 1 round, and there is no combat, so no shadow cards, hypothetically, then you can trigger it at that point and draw a card, and then in the travel phase, the encounter phase, the combat phase, the refresh phase, the resource phase, the planning phase, and the next quest phase before staging, meaning you've just drawn 8 cards as a result of scrying the encounter deck once, and raising your threat a lot.
Yes, which of course is something of the limiting factor, is both having the means to raise your threat and the fact that you are doing so all the time. The other thing, I suppose, that can be mentioned is that it's a useful ability even if you don't set up all of this, essentially trying to exploit the once per phase limitations by just doing it once per round in every refresh phase.
Yes, but you can exploit it if you want.
Yes.
So moving on.
Okay, our third hero then is Brindle. She's a 7 threat cost hero with 3 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 3 hit points, the Noldor, House of Fingolfin and Noble traits, and her text reads, Response: after the active location is explored, return 1 ally of X cost from your discard pile to your hand. X is the threat of the active location.
Now, Idril, to my mind, doesn't have as much in the way of big moments in the story. She's Turgon's daughter, she's Tuor's wife, she's Erendiel's mother, which is possibly the most significant aspect. Other than that, there's the fact that she and Tuor were together responsible for creating the secret escape route out of Gondolin, which allowed them and Erendiel and a few others to escape, so that some of the people of Gondolin could actually survive, and this then later led to Erendiel still being around to sail to Valinor and get the Valar to come back and help. So, as far as her ability goes, obviously you can use it to retrieve dead allies, but you can also use it to retrieve allies who you've just discarded from your hand through whatever sorts of means, such as Daeron's runes, a certain ally that we'll get to that also discards from your hand, assorted of the Noldor effects from recent official content, and any other such things. Ziggle Minor, if you discard cards from the top of your deck as well. And you can just bring them back by exploring locations. It should be noted that you could be uncertain looking at it about the way it's phrased, and I checked with Ian. The cost of the ally does have to be an exact match for the threat of the active location that you just explored. It's not a case of up to. So if you explore a 3 threat location, you can't return a 1 cost or 2 cost ally to your hand.
So, of course, somewhat it's dependent on the quests.
Yeah, you potentially want to analyse your encounter deck and see, okay, so what threats do locations have? If the vast majority of locations have 2 threat, then you load up on 2-cost allies and then dump them into your discard pile.
It's generally a pretty powerful ability, of course, to get back an ally. Yeah. You can equally consider any temporary ally as well, if you can match the cost.
Yeah.
The ability to recycle a temporary ally
If you explore a 3-threat active location, you could return ally Elrond to your hand, for instance. A comparison that can obviously be made is Stand and Fight. It's not quite as good as Stand and Fight, because Stand and Fight you can do at any time, so you can just do it in an emergency when you suddenly, unexpectedly need another ally. Whereas this, you return it by exploring the active location, and then you can't play it until the next round, but it has a similar sort of effect.
I think equally, of course, Idril's probably going to be a bit more powerful with a few more players. Obviously, you need an active location.
Yes. Yes, in solo, you may not always have a location, so you can't trigger her. On the other hand, she's a low threat cost, good
Yes.
willpower.
Yes, which is the other thing. She is, as with most of the first stage heroes, -1 threat for her stats, as is Turgon, I don't think we mentioned.
Yes. Yeah, and those stats are the same as Sam Gamgee, which, I mean, he's all really reckoned to be a very good deal, getting 3 willpower for 8 threat. This is the 7 threat, and it's still incredibly good. Just to go a little bit more into things you can combo with her, ways that these allies may end up in your discard pile. Obviously, if you chump block, if you pair her with Turin, you can discard allies. That might be a way that you could sort of target it, where you've just travelled to a location and then you take an undefended attack on Turin and use his ability to discard an ally with a cost equal to the threat of the location you just travelled to. And it also works with some of the Edina abilities where you have to discard them. The Chieftain of Men, Hador, and Flamelight Flea Knight all lead to you discarding allies. Alright, so that's the 3 lore heroes. Moving on to the allies. Our first one is Aradhel. Aradhel is a unique 3-cost ally with 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points. She has the Noldor and House of Fingolfin traits and reads Response. After the active location is explored, discard the top card of your deck. If it is an ally, take it into your hand.
The first thing I know I feel looking at Aratel is that she probably works best in a kind of multi-sphere context, simply because it's obviously a very good ally swarm ability, but I'm not sure that there are enough lore allies to build an ally swarm deck in that regard.
Yeah.
Now, maybe I'm wrong because I haven't actually tried to do so, but...
Yeah. In the official card pool, you can obviously compare to Expert Treasure Hunter, except it's a case where you have to always name ally. That said, that is one of the ways that I like to use Expert Treasure Hunter outside of Hero Gandalf, where you just build a very ally-heavy deck and always name ally, because most of the time you don't mind discarding other things. This can combo with Hidden Cache, obviously, just as Expert Treasure Hunter can. It works for ally swarm decks, as you said.
Yes.
The one other thing that I really noted was that she kind of has anti-synergy with Idril, where Idril allows you to return allies from your discard pile when you explore the active location. Aradel discards anything that's not an ally from the top of your deck when you explore the active location. So she's discarding all the stuff that's not allies, and the allies are ending up in your hand, where you might prefer it the other way around, because Idril can get the allies back, but not anything else.
Possibly. On the other hand, of course, they might actually combo quite reasonably in a deck that's supposed to swarm a lot of allies, but is nevertheless losing them, because it's yet more ways to get them back into your hand.
Yeah, so, it's a case of you get all the allies into your hand quickly, play them, kill them off, bring them back, play them again. But at first glance, that was kind of my thought.
Yes. I suppose the only other thing to mention is that she is, of course, relatively expensive, but is obviously bringing a suitable stat line in that regard.
And a very useful ability if in the right deck.
Yes. In fact, yes, the one other small addition is that if you have a means of scrying your deck, then you also know whether you want to trigger her ability or not, potentially. Yes, moving on now. Our next ally then is the Dwarf of the Blue Mountains, who is a 2-cost ally with 1 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, 2 hit points, the Dwarf trait, and the text Dwarf of the Blue Mountains gets +1 hit point for each unique attachment you control.
Now this is another one of those cards that I would view as kind of a multi-sphere thing without being explicitly so, simply because if you look at the lore sphere in the first stage for unique attachments, there are very few. Even expanding to the approved list. On the approved list, there's Wingfoot and there's Elfstone, which of course is a temporary attachment anyway, and I think Wingfoot has no valid targets in the core first stage heroes. There are no rangers for you to put it on. And then as to the lore sphere itself, from the first stage set, I think there's 1?
Yes.
Maybe 2.
1.
Is that unique?
No, that one is not. There's 1 that is unique.
And it's a tricky one to use. So you really need to pair up Dwarf of the Blue Mountains with a different sphere, such as Tactics has things like the Blue Shield and Ringgill, or Mastery has Gerthang, Aranruth, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then you can get him some extra hit points.
Yes, and the nearest you could also mention is in a multiplayer context, you might consider having another deck play unique attachments onto you if they'd be useful, just to boost your Dwarves of the Blue Mountains, since of course he is not unique, so you can potentially get a lot of hit points.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that 1/1/2/2 for 2 resources, that stat line is kind of worth it anyway. But if you want to build around him, then you probably want to get some unique attachments from elsewhere. And if you do build around him, I think you can turn him into a pretty beefy defender. He's in the Law Sphere, so you can give him a Burning Brand. And
you obviously have access to some healing effects.
Yep,
so...
he already has 2 defense, 2 hit points. You can build up the hit point pool, and then maybe he is a decent target for what I was talking about with Kirdan, where you have the Dwarf defend. I mean, potentially you get 3 of them. You have them defend until they're getting low on hit points. Then you attach them to Kirdan, and he defends, and then they come back with all their hit points restored. Obviously, he also works well in a lore mastery context with Feanor, because Feanor can get those attachments out quickly.
Yes.
Things like Nauglamir.
Except, of course, Nauglamir is the one you maybe don't want because of the dwarf problem.
Yes, that note is for a different reason. Nauglamir is a problem with the Dwarf of the Blue Mountains because he is a dwarf, and you have to keep paying him off. So our next ally is Telkar the Smith. Telkar the Smith is a 3-cost ally with 1 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 3 hit points. He is unique and has the dwarf trait, and reads Action. Exhaust Telkar the Smith to choose an armor or weapon attachment in play. Until the end of the round, if the chosen attachment is armor, it gains attached character gets +1 defense. Until the end of the round, if the chosen attachment is a weapon, it gains attached character gets +1 attack.
One of the first things you actually notice is that he has the same stats as the Erebor Hammersmith.
Yes, which I would imagine is probably not an accident. Just figure these are the Smith stats.
To some extent. They're also
the
sort of
Hammersmith
reasonable
is
stats.
also presumably a blacksmith.
In this case, of course, a very interesting ability, and also, of course, a repeatable one. Every round, you can choose whether you need more defense or more attack, which also obviously gives it some good versatility. Although, of course, if you have some means of readying your allies, then...
Yes. I mean, I would say Telkar clearly has a lot of flexibility with the stat line. He has 1s in everything. 3 hit points makes him a decent defender, even with only 1 defense. Or you can use his ability for 2 different things. The attack boost may be of pretty limited use. Of course, in multiplayer, you can do it across table onto someone else's weapon, which is why it's not completely useless, because just for yourself, you could exhaust Telkar to increase someone's attack if they have a weapon, or you could just have Telkar join the attack with his 1 attack to the exact same result, unless you're doing something where you need to be attacking alone, like Madness of Rage or Ecthelion. Once again, he's a dwarf, so Nauglamir is going to be an issue.
Okay, our next ally then is the Green Elf Ranger. It's a 2-cost ally with 1 willpower, 1 attack, 0 defense, 2 hit points, the Nandor and Ranger traits, the ranged keyword, and the text Quest Action. Exhaust Green Elf Ranger to choose enemy or location. The next encounter card of the chosen type that is added to the staging area gets -3 threat until the end of the phase.
So this obviously is kind of like the Ithilien tracker in the official card pool, except the Green Elf Ranger can do it for locations or enemies, which means there's more use to having more than 1 of them. Obviously, this works well with scrying effects. If you know what the next card to be revealed is, then that works.
Of course, whereas the Ithilien tracker reduces the threat of an enemy to 0 and always 0, the Green Elf Ranger, it's -3.
Yes.
On the other hand...
There aren't a lot of things with more than 3 threats.
Exactly.
There are a reasonable number with 3 threat, but more is still uncommon.
Yeah, relatively rare. And even so...
4 threat down to 1 is still a pretty big deal.
Exactly.
I think one slight combination that you could consider would be if you're trying to make use of Celegorm from the Mastery Sphere, who gains attack for the locations in the staging area, then this guy may be helpful because you can exhaust him to reduce the threat of the next location by 3, thus making it less likely that you get location locked if you're leaving locations there deliberately to power up Celegorm. That's a little odd thing that is not that significant, but you can do it. Our next ally is Daeron. He is a 2-cost ally with 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points, the Teleri and Minstrel traits, and action. Exhaust Daeron to draw 2 cards, then discard 1 card from your hand.
I think it's worth mentioning Daeron is certainly a competitor for the best ally in the first stage content.
Yep, he is. Surprisingly enough, Daeron allows you to use Daeron's runes repeatedly.
One other thing I'd noticed that stat line is exactly the same as Aratel, but for 1 less resource. So even for his stat line, it's 2 resources for 2 willpower in a sphere that isn't spirit.
Yep, so you can just quest with him.
Yes.
Or you can just keep drawing cards.
Yes.
Which gets pretty ridiculous.
Yes.
Daeron's runes just being able to have 3 copies in your decks, as I'm sure you know, massively increases the efficiency. Having an ally that lets you have as many copies of Daeron's runes as there are rounds in the game before you finish, and without taking up any more slots in your deck, that's bonkers.
It's also an interesting thing that you can note that with using Daeron, your hand size will actually increase if you see that as relevant.
Yes, whereas you play Daeron's runes and you discard 1 card from your hand in exchange for the 2 cards that you've drawn, so your actual hand size remains the same. If you're playing with discard effects, like some of the Noldor stuff, then that may be relevant. Yeah. Whereas with Daeron, because you're not actually playing a card to trigger him, you're just exhausting him, you will draw 2 cards, discard 1, you've got 1 more card than you've started with. That concludes the allies from the War Sphere.
Moving on to attachments then. Our first attachment is Oath of Silence, which is a 0-cost attachment with the Oath trait, and it reads, attached to a hero, limit 1 per player. Forced, discard 1 card from your hand at the end of the round. Response, after Oath of Silence is attached to a hero you control, search your deck for 2 cards and add them to your hand. Then shuffle your deck.
Now this, obviously it's a trade-off. The forced discard at the end of the round is potentially a problem unless you're playing Hero Eristor, who is on the approved list. But in exchange for that, you get an amazing ability. For 0 cost, you attach this, you search your deck for 2 cards, compared to Gather Information, the side quest. Also 0 cost, but you have to use up a round's questing in order to get 1 card. 1 card for each player in the game, but still only 1 card, whereas this gets you 2, and you can still just quest normally, not sacrifice your progress to it.
I think one other thing, since you brought up Gather Information, is that you can play the Oath of Silence on another player in a multiplayer context, and the way that it's phrased very much makes it clear that that player will be the one to search their deck.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, of course, I mentioned Hero Eristor, which is the simple way of breaking this. But also just if you have a very efficient deck, possibly helped along by the fact that you just dug out 2 crucial cards from it, such as maybe High Kingship of the Noldor to give you a bunch more resources. If you can just empty your hand before the end of the round, then the Oath of Silence does nothing. You have no cards to discard, so you just have those 2 extra cards you dug out for free. But you have to keep doing it every round.
Obviously, also another possibility, if you start to actually look at particular quests, is that if there are any quests that are going to force you to discard attachments, then the Oath of Silence is a brilliantly disposable attachment in that regard.
Because it does nothing for you once you've played it. You play it, and then it's brilliant, and then you can happily get rid of it if anything forces you to discard an attachment. The only other points I would mention would be if you're using Daeron for your card draw, perhaps he's one of the cards that you pull out using Oath of Silence, then since you exhaust him each round to draw 2 cards and discard 1, adding in the discard for the Oath of Silence means that your hand will remain the same size. You can maintain parity for a while like that as you play cards out of your hand and eventually get down to nothing, probably. And the other is that, of course, this is the last oath, and so it does work with Hold to the Oath, the leadership event. Our next attachment is Hold en Ndengin. It is a one-cost attachment with the condition trait, and reads, attached to a location in play. While Hold en Ndengin has at least one face-down attachment, the threat of the attached location is reduced to 0. Response. After a character is destroyed, attach that card face down to Hold en Ndengin. The translation is Hill of the Slain, and we're going to call it that for the rest of the review.
Yes, we are. I was going to say that. You also didn't mention it is, of course, unique.
Yes.
The immediate comparison, of course, are to things like Secret Paths or Power in the Earth, because it's the means of reducing a location's threat. Now,
obviously, it's better than Power in the Earth.
Yes,
because it reduces it to 0.
Exactly.
Though it requires more setup.
Yes, which is the one point. You can only really use it if either you're planning on chump blocking or you otherwise know that you're going to get a character destroyed.
Yes. Of course, it is somewhat like Power in the Earth in that it's mostly only going to be relevant if you're not going to explore that location, either in the staging area or by traveling to it, which can be a limitation because if you're using location control effects, then you'll explore the location and this goes away, and was it worth the amount of setup it required? It is a rather complicated card. Ian was commenting the other day in the Discord about custom cards, and that looking back at some of the first stage stuff, he has to fight the urge to go in and change things to simplify stuff that's too complicated. And if I had to guess, I would guess that this might be one of those cards. I don't know, but it's always struck me as overly complicated to trigger. Like, it might work better if it was just a response after a character is destroyed to put it into play. That might make more sense, and at least be simpler phrasing.
Moving on then. Our next attachment is Hidden House, which is a one-cost attachment with the Hideout trait, and reads, attached to a location in play. While the attached location is the active location, enemies do not make engagement checks.
So obviously you can compare this to the event Advance Warning, which prevents enemies making engagement checks for a round. This works well with anything that lets you attack the staging area, so Rochalor on Fingolfin. The Great Yew Bow, except for there are no targets for it, because there are no ranged heroes in the core first stage set. But beyond that, just as an option, you can use it sort of like Path of Need. It's not as powerful, clearly, but the same thing you can sort of do with Path of Need is you play it on a location in the staging area, and then just leave it there until you need it, where suddenly more enemies turn up than you can deal with, or a specific enemy turns up that you can't deal with, but which will engage you. And then you travel to the Hidden House, and you have one extra round's grace before having to deal with it.
It's a card that I know I've never actually managed to use, and I think you've actually just summed up, how to do it, whereas otherwise I looked at it and thought, well, if there are already enemies in play, then it might not actually be relevant to play Hidden House.
Because they've already engaged.
Exactly, so it doesn't necessarily help. And if there aren't any enemies in play, then is there much point in playing it? Because
yeah, you kind of, if you feel like that may come up, then you use it as a preemptive measure before you need it, and then just wait.
I think like a lot of the lore cards, and it's another thing that sort of defines lore as a sphere, there's a lot of cards that work better if you know what a particular quest is going to do to you.
Yeah.
So, in this case, knowing some bits about engagement costs.
Yeah.
So, if you're in a situation where you know that there might be some enemies along shortly with engagement costs that are a bit on the low side, then play Hidden House onto a relatively innocuous location and wait.
Yeah. The one other thing to note is that with Path of Need, of course, in the official card pool, you can do some shenanigans where you switch out the active location by sneak attacking West Road Travellers and that sort of thing. But I'm pretty sure there is nothing in the first stage or on the first stage approved list that allows you to swap the active location, so that is not an option here. Our next attachment is the Galen Horse. It is a 3-cost attachment with the Mount trait and reads, attached to a Noldor hero, limit 1 per hero. Action. Exhaust Galen Horse to place one progress token on each location in the staging area.
Well, the first immediate comparison is the Northern Tracker.
Yeah,
because
it does exactly the same thing,
yes.
but it's not an ally.
No, and indeed it's slightly cheaper, and there's one other point that can be to do with timing, because after all, with the Northern Tracker, you place the progress when they commit to the quest. With the horse, you can wait until after staging.
And then exhaust it.
Yes, before quest resolution.
So you catch any locations which were revealed during staging.
Which you've noted also comparing it to Asphalloth, which is also...
Asphalloth, of course, is not on the approved list, because horses don't live as long as elves.
The other things I would say is, as with Northern Trackers, I think it's a card that's more powerful with more players, because the usual fact that it's only when you really get up to about 3-4 players that...
Location lock becomes an issue.
Exactly.
Which you need to solve. And the other point is that, of course, with the Hill of the Slain, and indeed Hidden House, if you attach it to a location in the staging area and just wait until you need it, this will cause you problems, because if you keep going, you'll just explore the locations in the staging area, as I kind of brought up for the Hill of the Slain.
So the one last thing we could also mention is the limit on playing it on Noldor heroes.
Yes, but there are a decent number.
Exactly. There are 2 of the 3 lore heroes at Noldor, and I think Spirit may be the only sphere that doesn't have at least one Noldor hero.
Yeah, there are a total of 7.
Out of 15 is not bad, so in a big enough game for you to want to play multiple copies of it, and you will have enough targets.
And if you play the Elf Friend attachment, then that grants the Noldor trait.
Yes.
So it gives you potentially more targets if you really need your location control.
Yes.
Moving on to events.
Okay. Our first event is Arts of Felagund, which is a 3-cost event with the enchantment trait. And it reads, Quest action. Until the end of the phase, each enemy revealed during staging is discarded and replaced with the next encounter card instead. Add this card to the victory display. And it is also worth 1 victory point.
So, obviously, it works well for a turtling strategy, where you want to hang around while you build up your board state and not get murdered by all the enemies while you're hanging around. It potentially has issues where if you're discarding all the enemies and revealing the next card in each case, then you're going to get potentially hit by more treacheries, which can be worse than the enemies, or get a load more locations, which can lead to location lock. Of course, you could then have Galen Horses to solve that, but Galen Horse costs 3, Arts of Felagund costs 3, you're getting costly in terms of resources at this point.
I think one of the things I would say, this is one of those cards I've never used again, but I'd say there's some comparison to be made with Gildor's Council in a sort of roundabout way. Certainly, it is that it's another expensive card in that sort of awkward 3-cost mold, particularly 3-cost events are usually the tricky ones. So it might be useful, let's say it's if either you have no enemies and you just want to quest all out because you need to clear a quest stage.
Or you have enemies already.
And you have so many that you've already got all of your defences sort of held up.
Yeah.
So you need to not get more this round.
Yeah. The one other point I would note is that while I don't remember if such effects exist in the first stage, if there is a treachery that tells you to search the encounter deck and discard pile for an enemy and add it to the staging area, then I think that would not be blocked by Arts of Felagund, because it's added to the staging area. If the treachery said to find an enemy and reveal it, then you'd be fine. But if it's add to the staging area, then that bypasses the wording. Our next event is Past in Peace. It is a 1-cost event which reads Response. After you discard an ally with the Edina trait from your hand, lower your threat by the cost of that ally.
Well, the first thing worth noting is there aren't any Edina allies in lore, so you are going to need to have... This is another
one of those sort of multi-sphere effects, which goes best with leadership because they have the majority of the Edina allies.
Yes. The other things I'd say is you can obviously combo it with effects like Daeron or the Oath of Silence.
Yes, or certain Noldor effects from the official card pool, because you need a way to discard the ally from your hand, and otherwise those can be limited. The fact that it costs 1, as well as the fact you're discarding an ally, and the amount of threat reduction you get from it is never going to be that much. The most expensive Edina ally is 2 in Spirit for 4. Other than that, there are some 3-cost ones in Leadership, but it seems a bit costly to pay 1 when you can only trigger it at certain times to lower your threat by 3.
I think the nearest potentially useful point that could be made is simply that it's threat reduction outside of Spirit.
Yeah.
So it's probably not going to have the same kind of power to cost as a Spirit threat reduction card. But yeah, it's a tricky one to use, and it would very much be if you've built a deck around both having some effects that discard from your hand, like Daron and the Oath of Silence, and a bunch of Edine allies, and potentially Idril to actually put them back into your hand.
Yeah, Idril obviously works well with this, as with anything that discards from your hand.
Our next event then is a Great Doom, which is a 2-cost event with the Doom trait, and it reads, Response. After a player card is drawn or an encounter card is revealed, including a shadow effect, shuffle that card back into its deck and draw a new card.
So my feeling on this is always that it's a bit expensive, but on the other hand you're getting flexibility for that cost. Because you can compare it to a Test of Will or a Hasty Stroke. Each of those costs only 1, and you don't have to replace it with a different card, but it takes up more deck space because you want 3 copies of each. Whereas this costs 2, but it does whichever you want. You can also do it for player card draws, though I would say that's probably the least useful option of the 3.
It's an awkward one for me to discuss because I'm pretty sure I've never used it. It's, again, there's a lot of lore cards that have this sort of tricky aspect to
If it cost 1, then I think I'd use it a lot more. But at 2, it's a bit expensive. And the fact that you... Well, if it cost 1, or if you didn't have to replace the card afterwards for encounter cards.
Yes. I think the other thing you mentioned flexibility is that, of course, it does potentially do more than the Test of Will Hasty Stroke bit as well, because you can essentially get rid of any kind of card.
Yes, there is that.
I think it's just that in practice, usually you just rather have a Spirit deck running 3 copies of Test of Will and 3 copies of Hasty Stroke. And that's for shadow effects, obviously. A Burning Brand takes care of more.
As far as the option to use it for a player card draw, the only case where I can think it might be useful would be if you scryed the top of your deck and know there's nothing there that you want. And so the fact that it allows you to reshuffle is actually more important than changing out the card you've just drawn. Yes. But then you can potentially do that with, say, Master of the Forge, if you're really bothered about that, and Master of the Forge is repeatable. So, our next event is Secrets of Craft. It is a 1-cost event which reads Action. Choose a player. That player draws 1 card for each item attachment you control.
The first thing to mention is there really aren't enough items in lore to make it...
Yeah, again, there's the Elfstone, but that's temporary.
Yes. Burning Brand is probably the most obvious.
Forest Snares are items, I think, but there aren't a lot, is the point.
Yes. One of the small advantages that I'd mention is that it's a cheap form of card draw that can be used on other players.
Yes.
Which
it keys off the number of items that you control, but you can have someone else draw the cards. It might be easier if it keyed off the number of items they controlled, because then you could have a focused lore deck that could play this on a focused tactics deck, tactics having a lot of items because of weapons and armor all being items, and then they draw a load of cards. As it is, you have to kind of have a lore tactics combo where you get the items and then you can draw the cards or someone else can draw the cards.
And potentially, of course, since we're mentioning letting other people draw cards, it is also a good support card if other people are playing items onto your characters as well. The other thing is, of course, there's no real upper limit on it, so...
Well, the limit is how many items are there.
So there is an upper limit, but it's a very, very high one, theoretically. I would say, as well, for 1 resource, it's worth it even if you're getting, like, 2 or 3 cards out of that.
Yeah, well, you can compare it to Mithrandir's Advice.
Yes.
You tend to use that for 2 or 3 cards. This can be targeted on other players, and you can get up to more than 3. The final combo that I would say would be again, Feanor, because he can use his ability to play attachments of any sphere.
Yes, which...
So you could just take every item that you can possibly have and attach all of them and then play this to draw 10 cards.
Yes, having said that, one of the things I think with Secrets of Craft that's worth remembering is that if you're trying to hold off until you've got the maximum number of items to play it, then you aren't drawing those items to play.
Yeah.
So it can be worth finding a sensible middle ground.
Yeah.
Our next event then is Dreams from Elmo, which is a one-cost event with the Valor trait, and it reads, if the active location is a river or water location, reduce the cost to play Dreams from Elmo by 1. Action, choose one character you control. Shuffle the encounter deck and look at its top card. Until the end of the phase, the chosen character gets plus X willpower. X is equal to the revealed card's threat.
So I'll just mention a slight story bit. Elmo is one of the Valar being essentially the gods. Elmo in particular is responsible for water and the oceans, and he's also essentially the Gandalf of the Valar. While they're all sitting around having councils and feeling proud of how wise they are, Elmo is the one actually running around and doing things and encouraging other people to do things. So in terms of what the card does, obviously it's helpful that it lets you scry the encounter deck. You get to see what the next card is and can make decisions based on that. If you have already scried and seen a card that you don't want to be revealed, you reshuffle first.
Yes, one of the comparisons I would make is you can see it. If you play it before staging, you can almost see it as a preemptive combination of Secret Paths and Radagast's Cunning for the first card off the deck.
Yes, because...
assuming it's not a treachery anyway.
Yeah, if you get a location or an enemy, then a character who presumably you're questing with gets willpower added equal to that card's threat, which effectively cancels out that card. It potentially works with Beren, where, of course, we've commented that his resource generation only triggers when the revealed card cancels out his threat. This allows him to re-cancel it out and still get the resource. Or, of course, with the Green Elf Ranger, who already cancels out a card's threat, you can get the willpower boost but not face the card.
Another point as well is that if you know that the encounter deck has enough enemies and locations left in it compared to treacheries, and enough of those are high enough threat, then you can also try to use it to get maybe like an extra point or so as quest progress, maybe to turn questing unsuccessfully into successfully by playing it after staging.
Yes.
But obviously that's a lot more random, because you might reveal treachery with no threat and thus no willpower. You
might not get enough.
Exactly.
If there's any other use for willpower, then this also would work for that. I suppose there could be some weird shenanigans to pull with maybe Feanor. You play this to increase his willpower temporarily, then use his ability to play a load of attachments. His willpower will then go down again and he will become corrupted, but then if you have some means of uncorrupting him, like Dreadful Death, then he'd come back again after you've got all those attachments for free.
Yes, that's the point. The ability to raise some additional willpower in the first stage does have that extra.
Or I think Fair and Perilous is on the approved list, in which case you can turn that willpower into attack. And our final lore event is Friendship of Elmo. It is a 2-cost event with the Valor trait. If the active location is a river or water location, reduce the cost to play Friendship of Elmo by 2. So again, it makes it free. Action. Reveal all shadow cards in play. Then choose 2 shadow cards from different enemies and switch them.
I'd say, first of all, it's another card I haven't managed to use. Secondly, it's a couple of the combos I thought of looking at it were that it does synergize very well with the Halidin Woodsman. If you want to have shadow effects on enemies engaged with that player, presumably that player, because it's more likely to actually work in a multiplayer context again, because you need at least 2 enemies in play.
Or, of course, if there are more than 2 enemies, I mentioned for the Halidin Woodsman that it can matter what order you defend in. Then also you can look at that and be like, okay, so I'm going to defend this enemy with someone who's not the Halidin Woodsman first. So I want this one to have a shadow effect
Exactly.
to boost the woodsman before he does his defense.
Exactly.
So if the shadow cards don't do that, you can switch them over.
Exactly. I think therefore it does become a lot more powerful with more players.
Yes.
What I would also note is how that it does have a negative synergy with Barahir, because Barahir's ability triggers when the shadow card is revealed and allows him to add defense to the defending character. There will not be a defending character
and it
at
does
this moment.
have the same phrasing that you reveal all shadow cards in play.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, obviously from the official card pool you can compare this to Silver Lamp, but Silver Lamp only works for enemies engaged with you and it has to be attached to a ready spirit hero, whereas this lets you look at all shadow cards in the whole of the board. Gives you perfect knowledge of what attack will kill what hero or ally and which one won't. Which can be worth a lot, though of course you can't plan around always having this, so you always have to plan to be able to deal with things like this.
I think this is where we come back to one of the reasons I haven't used it. I can see the theoretical value, but because you can't do it all the time, you can't really plan.
It's one of these things that is much more use, I would say, in a 3 or 4 player game where you quite possibly have a focused lore deck that's all about messing with the encounter deck and supporting the other players and dropping things like this at crucial moments when there are a ton of enemies on the board and you really need to know who is going to survive and who isn't.
Yes.
And potentially change who is going to survive and who isn't by swapping 2 of the cards. So I would say under those sorts of circumstances, it's worth it. And especially if it's a focused lore deck, it probably has good card draw, so you can be confident that you'll find this even if you only have 1 or 2 copies. You'll probably have it when you need it. At least one would hope. So that's all the lore cards, and we're now moving on to the 3 neutral cards from the first stage.
First of all, our 1 neutral ally is Melian, and she is a 3-cost unique ally with 4 willpower, 0 attack, 0 defense, 3 hit points, the Maya trait, and her text reads, at the end of the round, discard Melian from play. Melian cannot attack or defend. And response, after you play Melian from hand, choose a player and choose 1. Enemies do not make engagement checks against the chosen player until the end of the round. Enemies cannot attack the chosen player this round, or the chosen player may look at the top 3 cards of the encounter deck.
Now, I'll just mention that story-wise, Melian was, of course, one of the Maiar. She was Thingol's wife, and she was, in addition to Thingol's leadership, she was the big reason why Doriath stood as long as it did. If you think of Galadriel in Lothlorien and how her will, to a large extent, kept Lothlorien safe from the forces of Sauron, Melian was like that, only much more so.
More to the point, Melian was in fact Galadriel's mentor in the first stage, so the similarity doesn't really strike me as accidental.
So as far as her abilities go, firstly I'd note that she has 4 willpower for only 3 resources. Even if she only lasts 1 round, that's pretty good. And obviously she's kind of the first age equivalent of Gandalf, core Gandalf that is. She's a temporary 1-round ally who enters play and does some nice effect. In her case, she's not so flexible because she can only quest. And of course, her effects do only trigger when you play her from hand. You can't sneak attack her for them.
On the other hand, of course, she also has the advantage, as core Gandalf does, of being neutral. And she only costs 3 resources rather than 5.
So any round, if you have Melian in your hand and you have 3 heroes, you can play her. Of course, you might not have 3 heroes. One of them might be dead, or you might be using this neutral attachment that we're going to get to in a minute. But the majority of the time, you have 3 heroes, you draw Melian, you can play her anytime you want.
Yes. Beyond that, she is... Well, her willpower is obviously useful, and is, of course, the only thing that she can really do, since the whole cannot attack or defend.
Yep. She has 3 hit points, so she can soak up some archery damage or other direct damage.
Most likely up to 3 points of archery, in fact, come the combat phase when you don't, in fact, need her anymore.
Yep.
Other direct damage, obviously, you probably don't want to kill her off before quest resolution.
Yeah. Anything which forces you to discard an ally, such as Turin's second ability, where he can discard an ally to cancel some damage to himself. She's a great choice because she gets discarded anyway.
I've used that combination more than a few times. The other point that we should probably bring up is that of her 3 enters play abilities, all 3 of them have a definite use, particularly in the first stage.
Yes.
Because...
So obviously, scrying the top 3 cards of the encounter deck is very good. There are not that many scrying effects that let you see more than 1 card. So, I mean, in solo, that's potentially 3 rounds worth of knowledge, or 1 staging, 1 shadow card, 1 more staging. And in multiplayer, you can go up to 3 players and you know exactly what you're getting for staging this round, unless there's some surge.
Yeah. Or indeed, unless you use any kind of ability that reshuffles the deck. So you should always be aware of that.
Yeah. Of course, that knowledge combines well with things that trigger off the top card of the encounter deck, like, say, Dreams from Elmo or Turgon. Oh no, Dreams from Elmo shuffles.
Yes,
Turgon doesn't shuffle.
No.
Yes.
On the other hand...
Remembering which things shuffle and which don't.
On the other hand, of course, if you don't like what you see, then Dreams from Elmo could be a perfect play.
Yes, and Turgon, it does work. So if you play Melian during the planning phase, you see the top 3 cards, you know what the top card is, so if you raise your threat during the planning phase and then during the quest phase before staging, or indeed if you are playing with only 1 or 2 players, you'll still know what the 3rd card down is and can continue triggering Turgon afterwards to draw more cards.
But yes, so the scrying is obvious. Obviously, preventing enemies attacking 1 player is fairly amazing because that's effectively a neutral thicket of spears.
With 4 willpower attached.
Yes.
Of course, you have to do it in advance.
Yes.
Which is the difference. So yes, that's obviously very powerful. The engagement checks may seem less obvious how good it is. Of course, there are cases where you don't have enough attack to kill the enemies, so you don't want them to engage you at all, but maybe next round you'll be alright. Or, of course, there is the simple point where, in a lot of circumstances, you might think, well, why would I choose to not have the enemies make engagement checks when I could just choose to engage them but have them not attack me, and then I can kill them? But a potential reason why this is still worth it is the Relentless keyword, which, from the First Age rules, Relentless is a new keyword found on enemies. An enemy with Relentless cannot have its attack cancelled or be prevented from attacking by any player card effect. It still can be targeted by other effects that do not specifically prevent attacks.
Consequently, a Relentless enemy cannot be targeted with Feint or
Thicket of Spears, Out of Sight, anything like that. Forest Snare. You could attach a Forest Snare, but it wouldn't do anything.
So therefore, Melian does not work on Relentless enemies, so if either there is a Relentless enemy in play that you're going to have to engage this round, or you know there is about to be a Relentless enemy in play because of the quest mechanics,
then you can just say, no engagement checks, the enemy will stay in the staging area, and you can put it off for another round.
The biggest trap there, of course, is that the engagement checks effect only works for 1 player. So, as the number of players increase, it's less likely you'll be able to hold them off from everyone. But that, of course, can come down to a mixture of engagement costs and player threat. And
and of course, since Melian is unique, you can't all play her at the same time to make no engagement checks at all. So, our 1 neutral attachment now is Solitary Outlaw. Solitary Outlaw is a 0-cost attachment with the condition trait. It reads, limit 1 per hero. Setup. Attached to a hero. This hero must be the only hero you control. Attached hero gets +2 willpower, +2 attack, +2 defense, +2 hit points, and does not exhaust the quest.
Now, this is fairly obviously an attachment designed for essentially solo hero decks.
Yes, that's the only place that you can play it.
Which is an interesting concept. I have tried to play around with this a bit, and I've found it doesn't necessarily always work as a single-player option, because while you may have those stat boosts while your 1 hero doesn't exhaust quest, you still may not have as much willpower as you would have had with 3 heroes, and you're certainly not generating as many resources. Now, obviously, secrecy cards like Resourceful do something to fix that, but it will still take you a few rounds to kind of get set up. So it can help to have a companion player who is running a more typical deck.
Yeah, I would say it's potentially solo viable, but possibly not with any hero. Where I would say you can probably build a decent solitary outlaw deck with any hero you choose, more or less, for multiplayer. But for solo, you need to pick someone who has decent willpower so that you don't get location locked or whatever, or indeed enemy locked, because everything's engagement costs are above your threat, so they'll stay there. And you need good card draw, really, is fairly significant because you need to find the other crucial pieces like resourceful, maybe High Kingship of the Noldor if you want to use it.
Or it can use it,
yes,
of course.
anything specific to your hero, like Erendil might need Vingalot, Luthien might need the Shadowy Cloak, that sort of thing. Or you want to get some allies out. All these sorts of things. Unexpected Courage is another one, because you don't exhaust to quest, but you still exhaust to defend, and you still exhaust to attack, so you can only do one of those each round, leaving you one action short of revealing an enemy, defending it, and killing it.
One of the, therefore, immediately strong combinations in terms of a hero to use is, of course, Turin, because there you don't need to exhaust to defend, you simply have played an ally, let them die instead, and then Turin is both ready to attack and can pretty reliably have enough attack to kill the enemy, because he'll have 4 attack between Sultry Outlaw and his base stats, and you can just raise your threat as much as you like. And with a starting threat of 9, you've got quite a lot of room to play around with.
Yeah, it's worth noting that also Fingolfin with a starting threat of 11, you can use his ability a fair amount, and you could potentially use the extra ability on Ringil to lower your threat instead of killing enemies sometimes, particularly since you're starting from 3 attack instead of only 1, and go up to 5 with Ringil.
Yeah. Equally, of course, I'd say Fingolfin is another one that looks very effective with Sultry Outlaw. Maybe not for questing, because you'll still only be 3 willpower.
For 3, but he defends for 6.
Yes.
And has 8 hit points.
Yes, and if you can get hold of Ringil and Rochelor, you can now attack into the staging area for 6 or 7 by my count. Your threat's possibly low enough that that will actually happen, and that's high enough attack that you can either lower your threat or kill an enemy, depends on which you'd prefer.
Yeah, it's significant to note that increasing your willpower gives you more scope for taking corruption, so Feanor is another obvious candidate for Solitary Outlaw. He'll have 5 willpower, and that potentially solves your resource problems as well. If you draw a bunch of attachments right at the start, you can play 5 of them if you really want.
Yes.
The other point to note about a single hero deck is obviously you're limited to 1 sphere. You might want to include songs to give you access to other spheres or a good harvest. But then, of course, that relies on you being able to draw those before you draw the out-of-sphere cards.
Really, I think the card draw is probably the important one, because I know I've built decks around Sultry Outlaw, and there's always that desire to have a few cards from a different sphere. Whatever combination seems to make most sense, of course, but that does mean that you're having to splash the relevant type of song as well, and probably 3 copies just so you find it fast.
Yeah.
And then you've got your out-of-sphere cards, and you really do need some means of drawing them.
Yeah. So yeah, Solitary Outlaw is an incredibly interesting card. It's one which you look at and you're like, oh yes, I want to build with this, but actually making it work turns out to be a lot more complicated.
Our last card then is our neutral event, Liga. It's a 0-cost event that reads, Action. Exhaust characters with X points of total defense to choose enemies with up to X points of total attack. Those enemies cannot attack this round.
Now, firstly, I'd like to mention that when I initially looked at this card, I thought, well, why would you ever play this? Why would you not free up those 3 slots in your deck and just have the characters you're exhausting defend those enemies? I mean, yeah, this, feint avoids shadow effects, but still, you could just defend, and you've used the same number of actions, but you have something else in your hand that you could use for something different. Then the realization of why actually you play this is when you think about it carefully and see that the comparison is not between enemies and characters, it is between attack on the enemies and defense on the characters. So say you have 3 enemies with 2 attack each, you don't have to exhaust 3 characters with 2 defense each. You can exhaust Fingolfin with the blue shield, who has 6 defense, and none of those 3 enemies will attack.
You basically said everything that was essentially my first thoughts on looking at the cards. We kind of went through that together, I believe.
You initially see it as, well, it's not... Like, because thinking of Feint as a comparison, part of the advantage is you don't have to deal with the attack, you don't have to deal with the shadow effect. It's mostly, though, that you don't have to exhaust a character to defend, so you gain an action out of it. So you look at this and think, well, why would I do this when I'm still losing the actions? But when, in fact, it allows you to use 1 action to cover 3 defenses, and so you have 2 characters who might otherwise have had to defend still ready to attack, that makes a huge difference.
It's also that it can be used as an effective sentinel effect as well.
Yes.
Because characters without sentinel can still be used to target enemies engaged with a different player.
Yep. You can spread them around. You can say, okay, so this enemy engaged with me, this enemy engaged with you, this enemy engaged with the 3rd player. They don't attack, but other enemies will still attack. You don't have to just hit all of your enemies or all of their enemies like you would with Thicket of Spears. So it's incredibly flexible.
Yeah.
And only costs 0, and it's neutral, so you can put it in any deck.
Yes. The other thing, if we're talking flexibility, is that you can also see it the other way. If you've got a very strong enemy that you really want to stop attacking, then it becomes a bit more like Stand Together.
Yeah, a card which is not generally played, but against an incredibly strong enemy, there exists one enemy in the first age which has a double-digit attack value. I'll just mention that. So you potentially would like to stop that enemy attacking, and that's a case where Stand Together doesn't look so bad, so you can exhaust Fingolfin and a Gondolin Guard, and maybe another Gondolin Guard, to stop that enemy attacking, or indeed just so they can all 3 defend it at the same time. That's an option. But with Liga, it can work as Stand Together, but it can also work, as I described, to cover multiple defenses with less actions. So that flexibility makes it easier to justify putting it in a deck than Stand Together. As soon as I realised that you could cancel multiple attacks with 1 exhaust, I realised this is actually just a fantastic card. Yeah. And I put it in basically any deck that uses Fingolfin.
Yeah, well, it's another thing I'd say with Fingolfin and, of course, the comparable official hero is Baragon, that you get them up to 6 defense.
And then they have 1 thing they can defend that stands no chance of damaging them, but then there are 3 other enemies in play.
And actually, sometimes, I mean, you can look at, certainly Baragon, there have been games where I'll be realising I actually would have been fine with 4 defence here.
You don't need this shield. Nothing attacks for that much.
Exactly. You know, it's useful when you do find something that hits you that hard. But
so this potentially gives you a use for having more defense than you actually need. I will note that you could, of course, combine this with Solitary Outlaw.
Yes,
so then you get Solitary Outlaw Fingolfin with the blue shield has 8 defense. And how many enemies are actually going to attack if you play Liga? It's not a lot. So that concludes all of the cards from the first stage. Let me know if you have any other thoughts on them. I will be moving on to video playthroughs of the 3 scenarios next. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
And goodbye.